I've never been one to believe in ghosts, or so I thought until one fateful autumn night that changed everything. I still remember every detail as if it were yesterday. It was the night I returned to my childhood home, a creaking old farmhouse tucked away on the edge of Maple Grove. I'd left years ago, determined to escape the town's superstitions, but a sudden need for closure drew me back. It was well past midnight when I arrived. The wind was howling, carrying with it an almost tangible chill that seeped through every crack of the weathered wooden walls. I parked my car under a barren oak tree and hesitated before stepping out. My heart pounded with a mixture of apprehension and nostalgia. I'd heard whispers about strange occurrences in that house since I was a kid, tales of soft voices and shadows moving on their own. I dismissed them as the product of overactive imagination, until that night. The front door creaked open with a reluctant groan as I pushed it, as though protesting my return. Inside, the familiar scent of old wood and dust mingled with something inexplicably cold. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow swath through the darkness. I made my way into the living room, where the light from the street barely filtered through grimy windows. Every step on the creaking floorboards echoed in the silence, amplifying my growing unease. As I sat in the worn armchair, trying to shake off the creeping dread, I noticed something odd. There was a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper, barely audible over the howling wind outside. I convinced myself it was nothing more than the old house settling, but then it came again, a hushed murmur that seemed to be calling my name. Ellie! Ellie! The voice was soft, plaintive, and hauntingly real. I froze. The sound wasn't coming from any speaker or wind chime. It was coming from the shadows. My skin crawled as I leaned forward, straining to discern its source. The room felt unnaturally cold, and I could see my breath in the weak beam of my flashlight. I stood up, heart hammering in my chest, and followed the voice down a narrow hallway that I hadn't visited in years. Every step felt like I was trespassing on forbidden ground. The old portraits lining the walls seemed to watch me with sorrowful eyes. At the end of the hall, a heavy door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, the creak of the hinges punctuating the oppressive silence. Inside was a small study, a room filled with dusty books and relics of a bygone era, and then I saw it. On the far side of the room, by a broken window, a faint glow emanated from a cracked mirror. I approached cautiously, each step measured and heavy with dread. In the mirror's reflection behind me, I noticed a shape, a figure of a woman, her eyes empty and her face etched with despair. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Yet when I turned back, the reflection was still there, and the soft, sorrowful whisper now filled the entire space. I'm so alone. I remember thinking, this can't be real, but deep down I knew it was. The voice was not a trick of the mind, it was pleading. I felt a compulsion to help, to reach out to the unseen presence. As I stood rooted to the spot, the temperature dropped even further, and I saw the figure in the mirror begin to change. The woman's image grew more defined, her spectral features twisted in anguish. I could almost see tears glistening on her pale cheeks. In that moment, I realized her story must be one of heartbreak, a lost soul trapped in the remnants of a shattered past. Unable to resist, I whispered, "Who are you? What do you need?" The response was immediate. A sudden gust of wind that extinguished my flashlight for a brief, terrifying moment. When the light flickered back on, the study was empty once more. I was alone. Yet the echo of her voice still lingered in my ears, and the mirror now bore a single word scrawled in what looked like condensation. Forgive. For hours, or perhaps minutes, though it felt like an eternity, I remained in that study, haunted by memories of childhood and half-remembered legends. I recalled the story my grandmother once told me about a tragic accident that had occurred in that very house. A young mother had lost her only child under mysterious circumstances, and in her overwhelming grief, she had vanished without a trace. Some said her spirit lingered, trapped by an unending remorse and longing for absolution. At that moment, it all made sense. The whispered pleas, the sorrowful image in the mirror. It was her, seeking forgiveness, or perhaps desperate for someone to remember her pain. I knew I had to do something. I spent the next few hours searching the house for clues, scouring dusty journals and old photographs in the attic. I found fragments of letters and entries in a tattered diary that painted a picture of a woman named Margaret, a kind, gentle soul who had loved her child fiercely. The diary recounted moments of happiness, abruptly interrupted by tragedy. Her final entry was a desperate plea for forgiveness from the world that had taken everything from her. As the night wore on, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and determination. I decided that if Margaret's spirit was still here, she needed to be freed from the shackles of her guilt. The next day, I visited the town library and dug through old records, speaking with the few remaining elders who still remembered the old stories. One elderly man, his eyes filled with memories, confirmed what I had pieced together. Margaret had indeed lost her child, and her disappearance had been as mysterious as it was heartbreaking. The legend said that her spirit was doomed to wander the halls of that house until someone could offer her the forgiveness she so desperately sought. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the farmhouse at dusk the following evening. I gathered what I could: a few candles, a faded photograph of Margaret, taken long ago by my grandmother, and a small note I had written from my heart. I set these items in the study, right in front of the mirror where her image had once appeared so clearly. In a trembling voice, I spoke aloud, apologizing on her behalf, thanking her for the love she had once known, and promising that her story would not be forgotten. I begged for her peace and forgiveness, for both her sake and mine. For a long, silent moment, nothing happened. Then, as if in answer to my plea, the room filled with a soft, warm light. The mirror's surface shimmered, and I saw, one last time, the sad face of Margaret. But this time, her expression was one of relief rather than despair. The air grew calm, and the oppressive chill lifted. Slowly, as though dissolving into the ether, her image faded away. The whisper, once so anguished, was replaced by a gentle sigh, a sound of release, of letting go. For a long, silent moment, nothing happened. Then, as if in answer to my plea, the room filled with a soft, warm light. The mirror's surface shimmered, and I saw, one last time, the sad face of Margaret. But this time, her expression was one of relief rather than despair. The air grew calm, and the oppressive chill lifted. Slowly, as though dissolving into the ether, her image faded away. The whisper, once so anguished, was replaced by a gentle sigh, a sound of release, of letting go. I sat there long after the light had vanished, overwhelmed by a bittersweet sense of closure. The house, once filled with sorrowful echoes, now felt strangely peaceful. I knew that I had done what needed to be done. Margaret's spirit, I hoped, could now rest in peace. In the years that followed, I often thought back to that night. The experience changed me in ways I can hardly describe. I became a quiet guardian of the stories of the past, determined to remember and honor those whose voices were silenced by tragedy. I would sometimes hear faint echoes of whispers on cold, lonely nights. But they no longer filled me with dread. They were reminders that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, there is a chance for forgiveness and redemption. I share this story not to scare you, but to remind you that every place, every old house has its history, a tapestry woven with joy, sorrow, and sometimes regret. And if you ever find yourself in a place where the walls seem to speak, listen closely. You might just hear the gentle plea of a lost soul, seeking the one thing that can set her free: understanding, compassion, and forgiveness.